right. Well, hopefully that was enough time for you to fill that out. Thank you for your patience. It seems weird for them to do those online evals, but still wanting time set aside in classes, but so be it. And like I said, today's going to actually be a really fun lecture because like I mentioned, we're going to start talking about the debate on whether animals, or specifically non-human animals, can develop language. And I mentioned that my research kind of touches in this area, at least the paper that I'm trying to publish right now does, where I'm looking at our black-capped chickadee calls. And I've mentioned that they produce calls with those 4 different note types, and the note types have a particular order. So we might call that their grammar, where A's come before B's, come before C's, come before D's. They're always in that order, but we can have multiples or omit any of those note types, but they always go together in that way, following those particular rules. And after looking at thousands and thousands of calls, I have only ever seen one that went against this order. There was one chickadee who produced a weird song where they had a C note before a B note. And we have no idea why, but it was so rare, and even though I have multiple vocalizations from that same individual, they never did it again. So we figured they were just having an off day. But that kind of leads us to this debate of, okay, so is that technically enough to count as grammar? Is that enough for us to start arguing about, okay, well, they're conveying meaning in a loose sense. Is this getting close to language? And so we have these sort of these searches into figuring out which components of those calls are saying what things. And it doesn't seem to be as easily translatable as what we have with, say, human languages, where we can look at particular sounds or combinations of sounds, usually have a discrete meaning. But we can see things like the more D notes in a call, the more agitated the birds are. So they typically produce lots of D notes when there's a predator around, and then fewer D notes when it's a less threatening predator. But the D notes are present for other things too. So we don't quite speak chickadee yet. But it's made me dip my toes into this debate of, can non-human animals actually develop language? And where do we put that line? Where do we call it language versus, say, just communication? And some people won't even agree that animals communicate in the same way that we frame communication. So if you ever start reading any papers on language and communication in non-human animals, they are almost always going to have a very precise definition of what they mean when they say communication. And so usually we're going to be talking about sort of the transfer of information. But again, on my PhD defense, when I had to defend my thesis, I got in trouble for using information. And they're like, can you define information? How do you know that they've sent a signal? How do you know that it's been received? So it gets very nitpicky. And honestly, for that reason, it's a really fun field to look at, because there is so much debate and discussion, and people get really into it. But we can sort of look at what exists and what we have available to us. What we call it, we can sort of decide from there. But I've mentioned early on that in my black-capped chickadees, we like looking at them and other songbirds because they're vocal learners. They have to learn to produce their vocalizations by listening to adults of their own species. So that's just like humans. And I had mentioned at the time that there are other vocal learning species as well. So here on the slide, we have dolphins and sea lions and parrots and chimpanzees. These are all vocal learning species that have been fairly well studied, especially on their ability to pick up language. Not necessarily on having their own language, but on sort of learning and using a human-created language. So some of the dolphin research is very, very interesting, where they'll have things like kind of like a keyboard in the water, and different buttons are associated with different things. So they push a button that means this kind of fish. Oh, thank you. And so they'll say there's a button for give and then buttons for different kinds of fish. And they find typically that the dolphins will sit there and over again say, give favorite kind of fish. So they learn that if I do this, then I get fish. But it's not necessarily complex enough for them to say it's language acquired. In parrots, there's some really interesting studies. If you've looked at, I think it was Alex the parrot at the conference that I attend every year. We had the woman who worked with Alex, and she spoke as our guest lecturer this year. And so she talked about all the research that they had done and the fact that they were sort of pointing to him having this grasp of knowledge and concepts and maybe language because they were at the point where he could perform math questions. And they could ask him very precise things. So she would show him a plate, and on the plate there'd be different colored things. So some keys, some cubes, some beads, whatever. And then so she could say to him, say, Alex, how many blue cubes? And he could count them out. And he'd know to distinguish blue cubes from blue keys. And he'd know to distinguish blue cubes from, say, red cubes. And then you could ask how many blue and red cubes and get those counted up. So there's lots of different processes like that they were doing. But unfortunately, Alex ended up passing away fairly suddenly. He was I think he was in his 40s, which for parrots is actually fairly young because he was an African gray and they can live into their 60s or even potentially 80s. So very, very interesting research there. I'm not super familiar with the sea lion work just because I haven't heard tons of their research yet. But with chimpanzees and other primates, we start seeing things like, can they learn sign language? So especially programs in zoos where they work very closely with their caretakers for years on end. And of course, since you have that really close connection, you start sort of picking up on things. So sometimes they could give verbal statements and get particular responses in return. And so of course that gets them started. Well, what if we teach them to communicate back? And so there are some situations where they'll have American Sign Language, so they'll teach sign language to these chimpanzees, as well as gorillas and some other primates, and they do a fairly decent job picking up on it. But again, a lot of that communication seems to be fairly simple. So they can get across that they want something, or they can identify particular things with the right signs, but it isn't as complex as, say, human language, where we put things together and have sort of rules for the order in which things are assembled. So it gets a lot closer to that telegraphic speech as opposed to, say, a full complex sentence. And they've also done things like teaching them to use sort of images. So instead of signing, they'll have a card that has a bunch of different images. So little graphics and little cubes. And so when they point at particular graphics, they represent different actions and items. And they can get some points across there. Again, still fairly simplistic. But there's quite a bit of work that's been done there. And one of the big restrictions, because they do find that they've gotten some fairly complex conversations, especially in some of the more quote unquote evolved of the primates. So if we get into things like gorillas, we start seeing a little bit closer to actual structured language with sign language. And the idea here is that they don't have the correct vocal apparatus to be able to produce human-like speech. So there's some disconnect there where they have this understanding and they can get some words out and some order out, but they don't have the ability to produce the same sounds. So maybe there was never any evolutionary pressure to do so. So some ideas there, but a lot of really interesting research that we've been able to look at. And yes, okay, and then Kanzi is one of those sort of big success stories, and not just because of their ability to acquire almost language, pseudo-language, if we're not stepping on any toes. Kanzi was able to learn a bunch of different symbols, but then also pass on what they had learned to another bonobo in the same enclosure, so a younger one. So we actually saw transmission between individuals that wasn't directed by human sort of intervention. And that's why they thought that was really, really cool. And so this is pretty interesting. They started looking specifically at receptive language because that production was having limitations. Again, that structure, the correct order of words. We got more telegraphic speech than actual structured sentences, but they respond fairly well to receptive language. So if they're given a command or a request, they could follow those requests quite often, even if they were strange combinations that they'd never heard before. So some evidence that there's that capacity there, but maybe not quite to the same point that human language is. So yeah, a very, very interesting field and lots of really cool research. So if that's ever something you're interested in, I can absolutely point you in the direction of some papers, mostly because I get to sit in on some talks by the people who are doing this kind of research, which is just really fun. Yep. Not in a ton of detail, just sort of the general idea of when would we say that it's language or not? Or why is it unlikely that we'd say it's language? So the lack of order and sort of they're not capable of producing the same sounds, and they don't have their own language, but they seem to be able to learn human-produced language. No. That's you don't need to know the names. All right, and then a couple of sort of random things I wanted to include before we move into problem solving. The first is just to sort of clarify with this whole language in the context of evolution. So I mentioned that with our different primates, they don't have the same vocal structures that we do, so there might not have been a push, an evolutionary pressure to develop spoken language. And so that kind of ties us nicely into this evolutionary context, which is there something that would make language beneficial? And there are competing theories, and of course, we can't really know for sure when it comes to evolution because it's happened so long in the past, but there are some pretty good logical explanations here. And so the idea here is that language could be a species-specific trait that comes from natural selection. And so if we think back to what evolution and natural selection are based on, evolution is that process of long-term change in the population. And it happens because of natural selection. So natural selection just means that there is a particular trait that is beneficial for that particular organism. So if we think of language as something that could be beneficial, communicating where things are, or maybe communicating the potential risk of something, that kind of makes sense. The ability to tell others to avoid a particular area or to go somewhere to get food, that would definitely be evolutionarily beneficial. So we would see increased fitness, meaning that you're likely to live longer and have more offspring if you have these beneficial traits. And so that tells us that natural selection should make those traits more and more common in the population because the offspring of people who have those traits are likely to have those traits too, and they're more likely to survive and so on. And so the idea here is that, okay, so we can communicate information and it's a lot more efficient than if we relied on trial and error figuring things out for yourself. So if we think of that danger area, so don't go over there, there's a bear. You don't want to learn that by trial and error because it could be dangerous, it could kill you. But if someone just tells you and you avoid it, you've saved all of that potential risk. And even if you survived, you might have been injured, or you might have had to burn through a lot of resources to get away, or whatever. So we can tell a story where it's very beneficial to have evolved that ability to communicate. And the scale of this benefit would get larger and larger as the groups that we have get larger. So as our sort of populations get larger and as we tend to live in larger groups, it makes sense to be able to communicate to everyone within that group. And then you benefit from the sort of accumulated knowledge of everyone else in that group. So we start seeing this compounding effect. And so we do know that human groups started to get larger. We'd see evidence for larger and larger settlements. So it kind of lines up that language should have been sort of selected for and evolving at that same time. So not only do we have sort of some shared social learning where we learn language from our parents, but we also had that evolutionary side of things that makes it easier for us to acquire language because it was so beneficial to our survival. So we wouldn't say that it's just biology, we wouldn't say that it is just our social environment, it's a little bit of both. And this is the reasoning behind that. And of course, there's a lot of debate here. Some people say that we don't need that kind of explanation. Maybe it's some random mutation. There's lots of debates there. But most people will agree that there's no reason not to assume some evolutionary component. All right. And then the last of our random thoughts is this sort of integration of culture, language, and thought. And I think I hinted at this a little bit because this is one of those really interesting concepts, yet again. And so this is the idea of linguistic relativity, where one's language is going to determine the nature of one's thought. And all that means is that the way that you think about things, it could be shaped by your language. So I had mentioned before that if you only have a certain number of words to talk about something, you can only think about that thing using the words that you have. So I think I mentioned it in context of people who speak two languages. So if you're bilingual, maybe it's a little bit easier to think about a concept in one language over another. Maybe you have a better vocabulary, or maybe the words just fit better. If you can think in both languages, then maybe one works that little bit better. And so this theory kind of takes that to an extreme, saying that if we don't have the words to think about things, we won't be able to think the same way as others who have those words. And so you'll usually see this in the context of Whorf's hypothesis. So Benjamin Lee Whorf, back in the 50s, he focused in on the fact that there are sort of different cultures have different words to describe different things. And so he focused in on the English language and Inuit language. And he said that, okay, well, there are only two Inuit words for snow, or no, there are only two English words for snow, and there are as many as, I think he said 14 in the Inuit language, because that makes sense. They're around a lot of snow all the time, and it makes sense to have to distinguish between them. And so he said that they should then be able to classify and describe snow better, and so they would perceive snow differently. They would make those distinctions between different qualities of snow. And the problem with this was that a lot of his research in quotes, was mostly just observational. He didn't do any experiments. He didn't do any kind of measurements. He just made some general assumptions. So some early psychology type research where he thought about it and it made sense, and so he published it. There were also some follow-up ideas with things like color perception. So if we have more words for colors, we'd be able to better distinguish between those different types of colors. And so there's a language, so the Dani of Indonesia, they have only two words for color. They focus on warm versus cool colors. And then again, in English, we have all sorts of different color words. And then when they set up an actual experiment and looked at the ability to sort of perceive between different shades of colors, they found a slight improvement in performance for English speakers versus the Dani of Indonesia. So they had some slight benefit in order to sort of differentiate between different shades. And there's been lots and lots of follow-up on both of these types of experiments and others where they look at things like, okay, well, what about this language that has only this many words and that language that has tons more? What's the difference? And there seems to be a consensus that there is a slight advantage. So when you have more words to describe it, you kind of conceptualize them a little bit differently. But I like to think about this sort of taking a step back from the language and think about maybe experience. Because when I was younger, I wanted to be an artist. So before I went to university, I actually applied to arts college. So I applied to both a physics program and an illustration program because that was logical at the time. But as somebody who did a lot of art and who worked with a lot of different colors, I found that I was very good at perceiving different shades. And so maybe I'd show someone a couple of different colors and I'm trying to pick the color of paint for a room. And they would say, well, they're all just gray. It doesn't matter. Like, well, this one's sort of more blue or green or sort of pinky undertones and all these things. So maybe it's my experience using different colors and different varieties of colors that allows me to do that. Because if you think about it, children in schools are shown a bunch of colors and, while they're learning to speak, they'll be shown sort of the color yellow and they have to recognize that it's yellow. So by having that experience of more colors, then maybe that's where that's coming from. So even though this is one of those things that's been really heavily studied and there's strong supporters and strong sort of opposers, maybe it's somewhere in the middle and we can say that it's a little bit more complex than what they present it as. So we'll see. But it's just interesting to point out multiple sides to that idea. All right, so our next section for this chapter is to start talking about problem solving. And so this is going to be another kind of fun topic. I find we actually get to end the semester in a really neat chapter talking about some really cool stuff, which is a nice way to wrap up. But if we want to talk about problem solving, we of course are going to give it a definition. So problem solving would be active efforts to discover what you have to do to achieve a goal that's not readily attainable. So of course, if the goal is easy to get to, if you already know the answer right off the bat, it's not really a problem. So it's only a problem if there are some steps that need to be taken, if you have to do something to get there. So we're going to focus on things where the answer or the solution isn't readily apparent, where we have to do a little bit of mental processing. And so we're going to talk about 3 distinct types of problem solving. These are kind of arbitrary, but these seem to be able to, you can sort most problems into these 3 categories. So the first is problems of inducing structure. So this basically says that people have to discover the relationships among different numbers, words, symbols, or ideas. So one of these examples would be something like an analogy. So you'd have to logic your way through. And these are the kinds of questions that I find a lot of textbooks include, and I absolutely hate because it's a lot of, basically, can you be a thesaurus? But things like, okay, so we have merchant and sell, and then customer and blank. So sometimes you'll see these worded as sell is to merchant as blank is to customer. And so the answer would be buy. So merchants sell things and customers buy things. So you have to understand the relationship between the first pair in order to think of the equivalent relationship between the next word and the word you're going to fill in. And so if we wanted lawyer is to client as doctor is to blank, that would be patient. And again, I don't love these kinds of questions. I, in fact, go out of my way to remove them from textbook pools because I find they're very restricting. So sometimes they're useful. You might see them in other classes. You don't see them in mine. But that's problems of inducing the structure. So we have to understand that relationship between the first 2 words to understand what should go in that blank. Our next type of problems are problems of arrangement. And so these require people to arrange the parts of a problem in a particular way that ends up satisfying some criterion. And typically when you have these kinds of problems, there are lots of different ways or lots of different orders that you can put things in, but only a couple of them could lead to a solution. So the textbook gives us a couple of examples here. They show us the string problem and some anagrams, which are on the next slide. But first, I want to mention the fact that these problems of arrangement usually are solved through insight. And we actually talked about insight when we were talking about learning, specifically Thorndike's cats in his puzzle boxes. And so we mentioned insight as that aha moment, where you go through trial and error and then all of a sudden the solution comes to you. And so we had said that with Thorndike and his cats, he had evidence against insight because he saw that gradual improvement, where slowly the cats were performing the correct order of actions in order to get out of the box. And so at the beginning, they were in the box for a really long time, and then they would get out faster and faster and faster as they learned which steps led to them getting out sooner. So this is the opposite, where we would see people not solving the problem, not solving the problem, not solving the problem, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, I figured it out. And that would be insight. So they'd go from spending forever in the box to all of a sudden getting out every single time now that they know what the exact answer is. So nice tie back to some older concepts. But there's a bunch of different ways we could do this. The textbook talks about something called the string problem. So there are two strings hanging in a corner of a room, and they're too short for you to be able to walk and hold both of them. How do you tie them together? And so there's a table, and on the table there's a screwdriver, some matches, and some cotton. What could you do to tie them together? And the textbook gives the answer that you could tie the screwdriver to one of the strings and swing it like a pendulum, and then go and stand at the other one and then catch the screwdriver and then tie them together. My initial thought was use the table. Drag the table to the middle of the room and then see if by getting up higher, you can get them closer together without having to do anything fancy. So this would be, there's a couple of different things you could try, but you'd have to perform different steps in a particular order to get to that solution. So you'd have to swing the thing with the screwdriver on it before you could grab them both and tie them together, or else it's not going to work. Anagrams are probably a little bit easier to visualize, but this is when you're putting the letters in order to make a word. So we have a couple of anagrams there. And so if you think about it, okay, well, what could we put those into order for? The first one is water, and the second one is joker. And the second one actually threw me for a little while. Anything with K's is difficult with anagrams, at least in my experience. But those would be our problems of arrangement. So steps in order, letters in order, things that go in a particular order fall under these arrangement problems. And then our last one are problems of transformation. So here, we require people to carry out a sequence of transformations in order to reach a specific goal. So this is going to be multi-step, changing the situation as you go. And they have a bunch of different examples of these. They talk about a hobbits and orc problem, which I'll show you on the next slide. There's also a water jar problem. There's lots of these complex concepts that you can come up with. And these transformation problems can be very, very challenging because they actually tell you what the goal is. So they tell you your starting point and they tell you the end point, but you have to figure out how to get from the start to the end. And sometimes the process can be a lot more steps than you might have thought. So the hobbit and orcs problem, you've probably seen this phrased in different ways. I've also seen it as sheep and wolves. I've seen it as pigs and cabbages. Basically, it's you have a boat and you have this number of different creatures, and only that number of these creatures can fit in the boat at a time, but you can't leave any of them alone with the other. So if it's wolves and sheep, you can't leave one sheep alone with the wolves. You'd have to keep all the sheep with you or something like that. And so here they have the orcs and hobbits, and so the problem's all described at the top, and they're saying, okay, well, if you leave the hobbits alone with the orcs, then the orcs will eat them. So what's the correct order in order to move them across the river? And so this is actually the solution to the problem, where you have to make sure that here that the hobbits outnumber the orcs. So there's a lot of back and forth in order to make sure that you don't hit a certain condition, a situation where the orcs would outnumber and then eat the hobbits. And then the water jar problem, the little one in the corner, is basically saying that you have all of these different sized containers. How many or which ones would you use in what combination to get a particular volume? So again, you'd have to sort of think sequentially, how do we take what we have here with these three different options and how do we get that outcome of a certain volume? So those are all different types of those, what do we call them, transformation problems. All right, so, okay, with all of these different kinds of problems, some of them can be fairly straightforward, but of course, if we're talking about thinking and rationalizing and reasoning, we should also talk about things that might be barriers to effective problem solving. What actually gets in the way of problem solving? So things like irrelevant information, you've probably encountered this in exam questions. Sometimes you read through a question and they've given you a whole bunch of information, and when you get to the end, you're like, wait, I don't need any of that. All I need to know is this one word in the last sentence, but they've given me all this other information, and so I was thinking it was more complex. That would be irrelevant information. So sometimes that's actually a tactic of some instructors to give lots of extra information to sort of make you think that they're going to be asking you about this, but they ask about something else instead. In real life, there's lots of irrelevant information. You'd have to evaluate a situation and figure out what's actually needed in order to solve this particular problem. But when we're looking at those kinds of logic problems and word problems and exam problems, sometimes the irrelevant information is intentionally included. So that can get in the way. We also run into an issue of functional fixedness. And this just means that once we get it in our mind that something is supposed to be used in a particular way, it's very difficult for us to look at it in a different way. And I find that a lot of people have a lot of trouble with this. This is one of my skills. I might be really clumsy and really bad at certain types of problem solving, but I'm really good at using things for their not intended purpose. So maybe you don't have a pair of scissors and you need to open a package. So you're going to look at other things. So it makes sense, like a knife, you can use a knife to cut a package. But I've had situations where people wouldn't think to use something like a screwdriver. It's like, well, if you can apply force at the right direction, you can use a screwdriver to open a package, even though that's not its function. But I've had other people in the room with a screwdriver looking for scissors for long periods of time, not realizing that they could use something else for a different purpose. And there's lots of really neat studies. I remember from a different class where they have this weird setup. So it's a candle that's supposed to be burning, and you have a box and some string and some cardboard, and you're supposed to use all of these items that are in this box to stop the candle from dripping on the table. And so most people will start pinning the cardboard and the candles to a board on the wall so that it can't get to the table. But you could also just put the candle in the box that all the supplies are in. But most people wouldn't think of that solution because the box is presented as just a method of holding and giving you all of those other supplies. So that would be a case of functional fixedness. So there's lots of different ways we can run into this. Another thing are mental sets. And so mental sets can actually be beneficial or detrimental depending on the situation. So a mental set is basically like a shortcut rule that we have in our brains. So if you've encountered a similar problem before and you're like, oh, I totally know how to solve this, that can be helpful. But it might also keep you from finding a more efficient solution. And a fantastic example of this, I think it's from another class, is one of these water jar problems where they have sort of the first thing is they want you to get a certain volume of water. And so the solution is to use 2 of the largest bins into a bowl, and then you have to take out 1 of each of the smaller 2. And so that's a fairly simple solution. And then they get you to do it again with different volumes. And so you say, okay, well, 2 of the largest, and then subtract 1 each of the 2 smaller. That's the solution. But people failed to notice that if they had just used 2 of the small ones, they could have gotten the same correct volume already. So it could have been done in fewer steps, but they had that mental set of we understand how to do this, so they would do it the more complex way. And so we can have lots of different mental sets from things we've encountered previously, and it can just sort of override that logical finding a new solution. And then there's also unnecessary constraints. And this can tie into a couple of different things, but this is when you assume that there are particular restrictions on what you need to do, even if they're not explicitly stated. And a great example of this is the 9-dot problem. So you might have seen this before, where they ask you to connect, so without lifting your pencil, draw no more than 4 straight lines that cross through all 9 of the dots. And so the restriction that people assume is that they have to draw their lines and bend in each of the dots. So they'd have to they'd go across and then they'd come down, and they do sort of a Z shape, and then they try and find a way to connect the others. But the actual solution for this problem is actually to think outside the box. So if you actually draw your line much further over, you can then connect more dots by getting outside of that shape. So this is a question that you've probably seen before, but if you haven't, the solutions are in the textbook. So there's a couple of different ways to do it, but it all involves you drawing lines outside of the boundary that they've given you. So you might not assume that it's good to go outside the boundary, but they didn't explicitly tell you that you couldn't, and that's the solution. All right, let me just double check here. I think I will stop here because the next thing to talk about are algorithms and heuristics, so 2 different ways to solve problems. And I kind of want to talk about them both together, so we will pick up here on Wednesday. And as I had intended before, we should be finishing up lecture content on Wednesday, which gives us Friday to sit and chat about review problems. So if you have anything that you want to go back over from previous chapters, bring in questions. I'm not going to prepare anything, so I'm not going to have sort of an intended structured lecture. I will just be here to answer questions and have discussions as you require. But yeah, so we'll pick up on Wednesday.